Hello guys, this is your friend Naruto What If Hub 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto was in Team 8? The legendary fanfic Part 2. Hinata was the first to arrive at Training Area 19. She'd left home earlier than strictly necessary, but she was happy to be out of the Hyuga compound. It was, she supposed, somewhat shameful that she felt happier away from her ancestral home. She knew that her father would see that as a demeaning lack of pride in her heritage. Hinata sometimes wondered what her mother would think, if she were still alive. Shino arrived a few minutes later. The Aburame boy was quiet, merely nodding to her when she greeted him. At first Hinata wondered if he was angry with her for disagreeing with him at lunch yesterday. But as she watched him examine the base of one of the trees, she remembered how quiet he had been at the academy. Perhaps he just didn't have anything to say. Kurenai arrived with another boy, and it took a moment for Hinata to recognize Naruto without the orange jumpsuit that had been his trademark over the last couple of years. He was frowning, making Hinata wondered what was wrong. Naruto was always smiling and joking, and for him to appear so grim. As they approached, Kurenai-sensei put her hand on his shoulder and said something too quiet to hear. Naruto nodded and shook himself, like a dog with wet fur, and then he straightened up and let out a sigh. Naruto grinned at everyone and she felt her face begin to flush again. "I'm glad to see you all got here early," Kurenai called out as they walked up. "Punctuality is important for what we do, or rather, being too late can be fatal." Shino didn't visibly react to their sensei's words. Instead, he just continued to look at her through his ever-present dark glasses. Hinata envied his reserve. Hinata did not know quite what to make of Naruto's new uniform. He looked rather good in it, she had to admit. It was also certainly more practical, but his orange jumpsuit had become such a part of him that it seemed strange to see him without it. The quiet way he approached with Kurenai-sensei was also at odds with his normal behavior. All of this made Hinata concerned for her teammate. She liked the Naruto that always smiled and tried again, and she didn't want to see that change. As she became more upset, a sudden thought gave her pause. She liked the loud, brassy Naruto, but did he necessarily like it himself? He'd looked so dejected after the Genin exam, and her mind wandered back to other times that he'd been down. Were those truly the only times he'd been upset, or were they the only times he let it show? Reading people was a high art among the Hyugas, ever since one of her clan leader ancestors took his Byakugan to a new level. Hinaro-san was the first to actively read a person's intentions from the tension in their bodies and the way they moved. The observations he made were said to be devastatingly accurate, and the Fire Lord often hired him to evaluate his courtiers and to aid his spymaster in weeding out the disloyal. His eyes were said to be acute enough to detect variations in a shinobi's pulse rate by observing the vibrations in the skin over their carotid arteries. There is even a rumor that fear of this formidable skill was what led the Hitaki family to begin wearing their traditional masks. As with most of her family's arts, Hinata was not very adept with body reading. She could see the disappointment and resentment that festered in the eyes of the clan elders, but they also didn't bother to conceal their feelings. Her cousin Neji, on the other hand, was said to be able to see things that the adults wished to keep unnoticed. From most people, Hinata could merely guess at their mental state. However, she had also spent a long time studying Naruto. She was no expert on his mercurial moods, but as she watched him approach, she didn't get a sense of sadness or anger from him. He was just reserved, in an odd way. At the same time, he also seemed very focused. When Kurenai-sensei spoke, Naruto took in every word. Not even Iruka-sensei at his angriest could command so much of Naruto's attention. Hinata found herself respecting the Jonin even more now, though she wondered what she had said or done to Naruto to earn such respect. Her curiosity became even stronger when the woman reached into the pouch at her waist and removed a pair of scrolls. She handed one to Shino and the other to Hinata. "These are some exercises I'd like you to perform on your own, outside of our team meetings." They are mostly speed and endurance building exercises, though there are also activities that should build up your chakra capacity and control. Hinata carefully placed the scroll in her weapons pouch. Anyo, sensei, what will we be doing during team meetings? Despite Kurenai sensei's kindly demeanor, Hinata still found it embarrassingly difficult to speak out or ask questions. That's a good question, Hinata, Kurenai replied evenly. I'd like this time to be spent working on things that would benefit from us all being together. For the speed and endurance training, I will leave it to each of you to make sure you are pushing yourselves as hard as you can. Remember, it won't just be you paying the penalty if you don't. But a team also needs to learn how to fight together. Sparring will let you test and improve your skills against one another, and it will also let you come to understand each other's fighting styles. From what I saw yesterday, they are quite different. Kurenai smiled, perhaps a little grimly. That knowledge will prove very useful when you fight together as a team. You will know how your teammates will react and be able to move with them smoothly to counter any threats. A well-trained shinobi team can move together like a well-oiled machine, and becomes much more effective than just the sum of its members. We call this extra bonus, synergy. With that, Kurenai put them to work. We'll start with just taijutsu today. No other techniques for right now. Just hand to hand. Hinata, why don't you and Naruto start? Light contact only. Hinata was a little nervous about sparring with Naruto first thing, but tried to control her reactions. Sensei was right, she needed to know her teammates as well as she knew herself. Naruto moved a little stiffly at first, perhaps because of his new clothes. Hinata activated her Byakugan so she could see his Tenketsu points, but she didn't push any chakra out of her palms as she struck. This way she could tell if she struck true, which wasn't as often as she liked, but didn't disable her teammate. Naruto jolted back on his heels when her palm slipped around his block and struck him flat on the chest. He smiled ruefully at her and shook his head. Her stomach gave an odd wobble as he dropped back into a ready stance. Naruto didn't seem to be upset that she'd scored on him. In fact, his look was almost approving. That thought made her falter and she almost missed a block. Naruto, of course, was pulling his punches at the last instant, neither of them was out to hurt the other. Nonetheless, his knuckles still jarred her shoulder. Mortified at her slip, Hinata grabbed his sleeve, wrapping her fingers around his arm just above the wrist. She brought her other hand in low, aiming for the Tenketsu point right above the hara, between the navel and diaphragm. Naruto twisted backwards to avoid the blow, but her hold on his arm limited his motion. Naruto purposefully fell backwards. Hinata let go of his arm so she could chamber a kick, but then realized that he had a handful of her jacket clenched in his fist now. Her unpredictable teammate rolled onto his back, pulling his knees up to his chest, and Hinata was yanked forward off her feet. He let go of her shoulder as her stomach came to rest on his sandals. Hinata barely saw the pleased grin on his face before she was launched into the air. Hinata found herself upside down, flying backwards through the air. She curled up to speed her rotation, and managed to get her feet under her before she landed, her back to Naruto. Good recoveries, both of you, Kurenai said, and with the Byakugan still active, Hinata could see her smiling without having to turn her head. She was embarrassed at her slip, and could see her father's disapproving glare in her mind, but no one here seemed to notice or care. Nonetheless, Naruto seemed a bit more focused when they resumed their match. His attacks sped up and became more fluid, and Hinata had to fully focus her concentration to block him. Every time she blocked one of his punches or kicks, his grin became a little wider, and Hinata found herself smiling a little as well. He really should have participated in the after-class sparring, she mused as she ducked under a looping roundhouse kick. She swept his supporting leg, but Naruto twisted sideways with the motion and landed in a handstand. His waist twisted and the foot she'd swept came arcing towards her face. She leaned back to avoid it, and as it passed she struck the back of his calf with the heel of her hand. This sent Naruto's lower body off balance to the left. He should have fallen to the ground, but he'd anticipated this and flexed his elbows, throwing his upper body into the air even as his legs rotated to the ground. He ended up on his feet in a comically wide stance, but the rotation brought his upper half in close to Hinata and his left hand came up inside her guard. She tried to flinch back from the fist rising toward her jaw, but it was too late. She closed her eyes and felt her head jolt. Instead of the expected pain of impact, her chin felt very warm. She opened her eyes, realizing that she'd dropped her Byakugan in her surprise. Naruto's hand was wrapped around the point of her chin, his fingers warm on her cheeks. Gotcha, he said, chuckling happily. He withdrew his hand as she blinked at him. I was moving too fast to be sure, so I opened my hand. He frowned. It didn't hurt, did it? Hinata shook her head, not trusting her voice. She knew she was blushing, but also realized that her whole face was red from exertion, so it hopefully did not show. In fact, she was dripping with sweat and it was becoming difficult to keep her arms from trembling. Naruto's face was a little flushed, but that was it. She was a little disturbed that he wasn't even breathing very hard. Very good, both of you, Kurenai-sensei called out. Adaptation, improvisation. But your weaknesses are not your techniques. Experience will only improve you both. Kurenai sparred with Shino next, to give them a breather. Predictably, her sensei was noticeably faster and stronger than Shino. Hinata's attention, however, was focused more on the blonde sitting on the grass next to her. He didn't even look like he'd been exercising now, and she wondered if he'd just been playing with her while they were sparring. I should have known I wasn't really that good, she mused reproachfully as she pressed her forefingers together. She was jolted out of her thoughts by Naruto's elbow. All those palm strikes were times you would have used chakra to shut me down. He asked her. Hinata nodded silently. Aside from Kurenai explaining the reasons why they trained together, it wasn't that like Jiyukin was that big a secret. Her family's famous techniques were described, in a general fashion, during the history lectures at the Konoha Ninja Academy. Naruto rubbed at the back of his head. Then I guess I got you twice and you would have demolished me at least a dozen. That's pretty good. Hinata turned and stared at the boy, but he didn't seem to be mocking her. Kurenai smiled as she put Shino through the ringer. The boy was a little larger and physically stronger than his teammates, and for the most part he hadn't been challenged that much the day before. She had a feeling that the boy was actually a bit more talented than he let on. As reserved as the boy's father had been, she realized that she shouldn't be surprised that his son would treat the academy like an infiltration assignment. In the back of her mind, Kurenai again wondered at how clueless the academy examiners seemed to be. If we are teaching children to be shinobi, she mused, then why should we expect straightforward tests of their abilities to be accurate? Some students would excel at those, of course. The Uchiha boy, Sasuke, seemed to have something to prove, so he would of course push himself to become the top of his class. But those might prove to be the exceptions. She'd stayed after the meeting where the genins were assigned and grilled Iruka for everything he could tell her about his charges. The Chunin was a little disconcerted by her attention, but gratified that she was actually interested in his observations, as well as the examination grades. In those, Shino was said to be merely average at taijutsu. He was more than capable of defeating someone without training, but was barely above the bottom third of his class at the academy. But now, placed on the spot against a superior opponent, the boy was executing blocks and counters at a level of proficiency approaching that of a Chunin. You've been holding out on us, she accused as she drove a spear hand strike at his midsection. He silently blocked with the edge of his wrist and sent a back fist strike against her temple. Kurenai stepped into it and blocked with her forearm. She brought up an unnoticed knee and tapped Shino in the stomach. He nodded, acknowledging her point, and stepped back into a ready stance again. She sent a kick at his midsection, but when he went to block, she pulled her foot back, rechambered the kick, and launched it again at his head. He ducked his head, but her heel clipped his shoulder on the way down. Shino drove 2 fingers into the hollow of her knee and she barely managed to pull her leg back before his nerve strike numbed it. You didn't learn that at the academy, she observed as he deflected a ridge hand strike she aimed at his floating ribs. Extra training with your family? She asked as she blocked his counterstrike at her stomach. Shino pushed back against her block and his feet slipped backwards a few inches on the grass. That evidently was his aim, as that motion gave him enough room to bring his foot up and kick. She caught his ankle between her palms and gave his leg a sharp twist. He leapt upward and retracted his leg, pulling himself closer for a knife hand strike at her face. The move was unexpected and well timed, and she barely pulled her head back in time to avoid it. As it was, his fingertips ghosted across the skin of her forehead. She used her grip on his ankle to throw him back and he somersaulted backwards once before rolling onto his feet and rising into a low crouch. Very good, Shino, Kurenai said approvingly. But if you wish to remain on this team, you will not hold back during our training sessions. I can understand your caution within the academy, but there should be no secrets between teammates. She saw Naruto give a guilty start out of the corner of her eye and knew he'd gotten the message as well. Shino merely nodded at this, which she accepted with good grace. She'd get him talking. Eventually, maybe. After that, Naruto sparred with Shino, and had a noticeably harder time landing a hit than he did the day before. Kurenai also took the opportunity to work with Hinata on her blocking techniques. Kobaru-sensei had done the same for her, many years ago. There were ways to angle the arms and legs that increased one's leverage. These modified blocks were not taught at the Konoha Ninja Academy because they required superior speed and timing to execute properly. For an agile kunoichi who possessed less upper body strength than her male counterparts, however, they were ideal. Hinata took to the techniques avidly, and Kurenai could tell she was flattered to be getting any individual instruction at all. If she didn't already despise Hiashi, the Hyuga girl's reactions would drive her to do so. When she explained why she was showing the girl the alternate techniques, Hinata just nodded thoughtfully. Kurenai was embarrassed to remember how she had given Kobaru a very hard time about his insinuation that she was weaker than Matai or Nomaru. After about half an hour of this, switching off sparring partners every few minutes, Kurenai found all of her genins to be somewhat worse for the wear. Naruto's new uniform was covered with dust and bits of grass from all the times he'd been knocked down. At the same time, he was also smiling broadly as he helped Hinata, who'd slipped to one knee after successfully blocking his last kick. The Hyuga girl was red-faced and barely able to stand, and Shino's chest moved rapidly enough to inform his teacher that he was breathing hard. All right, that's a good start. We can walk to cool down and let our muscles relax. I can tell we definitely need to work on endurance training. Make sure you follow the exercises I gave you, and ask me if anything is unclear. With that, she led them out of the training area and through the outskirts of the village. The villagers they passed had very different reactions to the genins placed in her charge. Hinata's eyes and unadorned forehead marked her as a member of one of Konoha's oldest and most powerful families. People who didn't know her gave her at least a respectful nod, and she returned those she noticed. Shino's clothing and glasses marked him as an aburame, and most people gave him a wide berth. A few glanced downward at their arms and legs, as if to make sure a bug hadn't crawled up onto them. Kurenai did have to wonder how commonplace it was for a member of Shino's clan to tag the people around them with the scent-producing female kikai bugs. The one she'd worked with explained that it helped him differentiate his teammates to the allies he'd stationed on guard duty. It also proved useful when a member of their team had been ambushed and wounded, and they needed to find him quickly. Of course, that didn't mean she was comfortable with the idea of someone ordering a bug to crawl onto her body and hide itself. She'd probably need to talk to Shino about that the next time she could speak to him alone. While Shino seemed either uninterested or unperturbed by the villagers' reactions, the same could not be said of Naruto. Maybe it was his acceptance by Uruka, maybe it was her own agreement that his treatment was unjustified. In any event, as Naruto received his normal allotment of angry glares and muttered oaths, he began to glare back. Soon he was walking with his hands fisted at his sides, on legs stiff with anger and resentment. Privately, Kurenai wondered if this wasn't a healthier attitude for him than his previous denial. At the same time, it wouldn't do for him to get into an altercation with random villagers. She resolved to let him work through his feelings on his own, but keep a close eye on him and offer advice if asked. By the time they'd arrived at the Hokage's tower, everyone appeared to have recovered from the sparring. She led them up the stairs to the top floor, and told the Chunins on duty that they were, Team 8 reporting for assignment. At her words, she noticed Naruto straighten his posture with pride, and even Hinata stopped looking downward for a moment. The Sandaime looked pleased to see them, and his eyes seemed to linger on Naruto's new clothes. His eyes then met hers, and she couldn't suppress a mild blush at the approval she saw in them. "You're just in time, Jonin Kurenai," the Hokage said. "We still have a few D-rank missions left." Kurenai inclined her head respectfully as the old man shuffled through a stack of papers on his desk. "There we are," he said, pulling one out. "I need you to report to herbalist Yukitaza in the Western District, near the river. He suffered a broken leg last week while working on his roof and needs some help." Kurenai led her students down to the exit, trying not to laugh at the confusion on Naruto's face, and echoed somewhat on Hinata's. As a new Genin team, she began before they even had a chance to ask her, "You will be assigned D-rank missions until you have completed a good number of them." She specifically avoided saying how many, because she wanted to have the option of delaying their first C-rank mission until she was sure they were ready. D-rank missions, she continued, are judged to be little or no threat, and should rarely, if ever, involve travel beyond the outer walls of Konoha. They are tasks that still need doing, will give you all an opportunity to practice working together, and will supply you with a little pocket money when you are done. She paused on a street corner while they digested this. Naruto still looked a little rebellious, but resigned to his fate. She stepped up the pace a little as they made their way to the western quarter of the village. When she rang the bell at the door of the house described in the mission briefing, a voice called out for them to come around to the rear deck. Herbalist Yukitaza proved to be a middle-aged unmarried man with a large cast on his left leg. He made a short double take when he recognized Naruto, but didn't react in any other way. Soon, Kurenai and Shino were working on the roof repairs, the Aburame boy having reluctantly mentioned helping his father perform a similar task last winter. Hinata and Naruto were put to work weeding the client's large garden plot, a task better suited to their smaller statures. They'd been working for a few minutes when Kurenai was startled to realize that it was Naruto carrying the next load of wood up the ladder. She looked over at Shino, who just shrugged. "Naruto," she said puzzled, "I thought you were going to help Hinata with the garden." Naruto grunted and laid the boards down on the shallow pitched roof. "There wasn't enough room," he said. Kurenai frowned and looked out over the backyard. Hinata was working on the garden plot, along with about 20 Narutos. Kurenai turned back to Naruto. "They can all work independently?" she asked. Bunshins were usually only capable of limited thought, following simple and straightforward commands. Naruto shrugged. "Why shouldn't they?" he asked. Kurenai wasn't quite sure how to answer that question. Naruto shook his head and turned to go back down the ladder. Unfortunately, he evidently forgot about the stack of boards he'd just put down, because he tripped over them and tumbled off the roof. Kurenai lunged forward, hoping to catch the boy, but it was too late. She reached the edge of the roof just as Naruto hit the ground, and disappeared in a puff of smoke. She stopped, staring at the vapors that rapidly dissipated. "I was talking to one of his bunshin and didn't even realize it," she mused. "What the hell is that boy?" She looked out at the garden, where Hinata had just grabbed Naruto's arm to prevent him from pulling up a plant that wasn't a weed. He scratched at the back of his head, not even noticing how Hinata pulled her hands back from his arm like they were burned. Not did he notice her blush, for all that it was brighter than his own. He's Uzumaki Naruto, Kurenai reminded herself ruefully, and he breaks the rules without even realizing it. Naruto and Hinata finished the garden in less than 20 minutes, with a clone starting at both ends of each row and Hinata using her Byakugan to supervise. With her ability to look in all directions at once, she could see if he missed anything or was about to pull something that wasn't a weed. The latter happened a little more often than Naruto would have liked, but Hinata didn't tease him about it. In fact, she seemed to worry that she wasn't doing her fair share of the work. Naruto wasn't any expert on girls, or kunoichi, by any stretch of the imagination. But he suspected that most of his female classmates would have been glad of an excuse to not get their hands dirty, rather than worrying that they weren't doing enough. He tried to tell Hinata that he appreciated her attitude, but when the words came out of his mouth it sounded more like, "I like how you're like a boy," instead of a girl, and she became very upset and then confused when he tried to explain. "I mean, you're not like Sakura or Ino," he said quickly. Hinata ducked her head down and looked even sadder. I know," she said hesitantly. "But that's a good thing," Naruto said quickly. "Did she like Sakura and Ino?" He wondered. "I don't remember ever seeing them talk, but they are all girls, they're like some secret society." It is?" she asked. Her forefingers were pressed together so hard that the skin had turned white. I mean, they are nice and all, I'm not saying they are ugly or anything," Naruto added quickly. If they were all friends and it got back to those two that he said they were ugly, genin or not, he was a dead shinobi. Hinata frowned, perplexed. Anyo, she swallowed. Naruto-kun, I don't understand what you mean. I'm just saying, well, I'm glad you're on my team, Naruto said firmly. There. No one could interpret anything bad out of that, right? Hinata stiffened like she'd been slapped, then quickly turned away. Naruto's mouth dropped open. He started to step around her to ask what he'd said when she pointed at one of his clones. Stop. He's about to pull a good plant, she said in a choked voice. Naruto whirled toward the offending clone. You heard her, he barked. Take it easy, Baka, the clone said. You're acting like she's your girlfriend or something. An instant later the clone disappeared as Naruto's fist transited through the space its head once occupied. Sorry, he apologized. Sometimes they get a little smart-mouthed when they know their time is almost up. We appear to be almost done, Naruto, Hinata said in a quiet voice, still not facing him. I will go inside and help Yukitaza-san with the kitchen. Naruto glared at the remaining bunshin as Hinata silently walked toward the house. All of them stayed bent over, peering carefully at the ground as they finished the weeding. After finishing outside, Naruto went indoors to help with the cleaning. Hinata was silent as he passed through the kitchen, very intently focused on dicing up some vegetables herbalist Yukitaza had delivered earlier that day. After locating the cleaning supplies, Naruto created another set of clones and put them to work tidying up. Fortunately, this was something he knew quite well how to do, having had to clean up his own apartment for years. He finished as Kurenai and Shino came down from the roof. Naruto sent his clones out to put away the tools and the ladders. Hinata was still busy in the kitchen, so Naruto and Shino were sent to make some deliveries to their clients' customers. Kurenai-sensei decided she would help Hinata finish. She gave Naruto a piercing look as she announced this, and he felt the back of his neck grow hot. As he ran down the street with a small bundle of herbs, Naruto tried to figure out what he'd done wrong. It wasn't like he'd asked the stupid bunshin to mouth off. Maybe Hinata thought it was saying something Naruto was thinking, and that was why she'd been offended. It sort of made sense in a way. Sakura always hit him soon after he'd asked her out. Naruto realized that his attempts to be friendly with her seemed to always make her angry at him. Maybe it was something about him, maybe it was some aura given off by that bastard fox. Perhaps it was a side effect of the seal used to imprison his unwanted tenant. Maybe a seal strong enough to repel a demon would also repel any girls he came into contact with as well. He scowled as he knocked on the door of his bundle's destination. An old woman opened it and Naruto handed her the package before she had a chance to realize who he was. This is from herbalist Yukitaza. He broke his leg and can't make his own deliveries today. With that, he spun and was halfway back to the street before the woman had a chance to speak. Naruto stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets as he made his way back to the herbalist's newly cleaned and repaired house. It was bad enough how people hated him for something that happened the day he was born, but now he was pissing off everyone else, even when he was trying to be nice. When he returned to the house, Hinata and Kurenai had finished up in the kitchen. With the deliveries made, the last tasks for their mission were completed. The herbalist thanked them for their help, and even looked Naruto in the eye, which impressed him a little. Not quite an hour and a half, Kurenai said after they made their goodbyes. That was very quick. Good use of your bunshins, Naruto, and coordinating with Hinata to make sure there were no problems. I'm very pleased with your teamwork, both of you. Naruto felt the knot of resentment in his middle loosen a bit. Hinata's reaction, however, caught his eye. She looked down, pushing her fingers together as her cheeks turned red. When she noticed him staring, she turned completely away. He frowned and let out a sigh. Evidently she was still mad at him or something. As they made their way back toward the center of the village, Kurenai peered up at the afternoon sun. At this point, I doubt the Hokage has any missions left to give out. Let's get together a little earlier tomorrow. If we work as fast as we did today, we can probably clear 2 missions a day. I'll see you all at the training ground at 10, all right? Everyone nodded, and then Kurenai pulled some slips of paper from her pouch. A friend of mine gave these to me, but I have something I need to do tonight, so I thought you 3 could use them. She handed one to each of her genins. It was a coupon for Ichiraku, good for a large bowl at half price. Naruto's stomach rumbled, but the way things were going he thought he'd rather eat alone. Thank you, sensei, he said, though he imagined his voice sounded a little subdued. His teammates echoed his thanks, though he noticed Shino looking at him a little oddly. Naruto also felt his sensei's eyes boring into him. Well, you'd better get going before the dinner rush starts, she said. You probably shouldn't stay out too late. Oh, before you go, Naruto, I needed to talk to you about your taijutsu training. You can catch up with the others. Naruto let out a quiet sigh as Shino and Hinata headed off to Ichiraku's. Okay Naruto, Kurenai said. I need you to let Guy know tomorrow morning that I'll be working with you all on Genjutsu recognition week after next. He can send Tenten and Lee over to training area 19 at noon, so they can participate. Got that? Naruto nodded and repeated back the relevant details. Good, Kurenai said, nodding her approval. Now, would you like to explain why you are less than enthusiastic about sharing a meal with your teammates? Naruto rubbed at the back of his neck. I seem to have annoyed them at some point today. Shino seems to be acting normally towards you, Kurenai observed. Naruto stayed silent. So it's Hinata, she surmised. Did this happen after you paid her some compliment? Naruto's mouth stayed shut, but his head betrayed him by giving a quick nod. I see, Kurenai said. She gazed down at him for several moments. It probably isn't my place to say anything, she finally spoke, but I've noticed that she doesn't always know what to do when someone says something positive about her. I wouldn't take it too personally, Naruto. Why is that? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Kurenai shook her head. Why don't you ask her yourself? Naruto opened his mouth, and then closed it. It was obvious to him that Kurenai-sensei knew more than she was saying, but she wanted him to find out for himself. Why are you making such a mystery out of things? Kurenai looked down at him and gave a faint smile. I know things about you that you would probably prefer that I keep to myself. Please extend your teammates the same courtesy. Naruto's stomach lurched when the meaning of her words sunk in. G. Gomen, he said quickly. Kurenai sighed and shook her head. No need to apologize, Naruto. You are still learning how a team works, and what a sensei does for their students. Just keep in mind that I'm probably helping other people in ways similar to how I help you. She her head, frowning, as the afternoon light glistened on her mane of black hair. Naruto, this is usually hard for someone your age to really understand, but keep in mind that not everything that happens around you is about you. Naruto frowned and scratched the side of his head as his mind raced. So, what you're saying is that she didn't act that way because she's mad at me. I'm saying that might be the case, Kurenai replied cryptically, or more likely it's a combination of things, and who you are played only a contributing role in the outcome. Naruto nodded slowly. I think I understand, a little. I don't understand why this has to be so complicated though. People have been asking that question for a long time, Kurenai replied in a serious voice. Naruto let out a sigh. It's not going to get any easier, is it? Probably not, Kurenai said with a slight smile. But few worthwhile things are easy, are they? I guess not. Thanks for explaining some of this, Naruto said, straightening. His stomach decided to lighten the mood by letting out a low rumble. That's partly my job, you know, his sensei said with a sad smile. Real-life examples of looking underneath the underneath seem to work the best. But you'd better get going before they eat all the ramen. Naruto knew she was just teasing him, but his pulse still sped up at the thought. After a quick bow, he began racing off across the rooftops to catch up with his team. He heard the quiet laughter that followed him, but, recognizing her voice, he just smiled himself. He caught sight of Shino and Hinata blocks before they reached the ramen stand. He landed lightly on the pavement behind them, but still they both turned as one to look at him. Well, we are supposed to be a reconnaissance team, he mused. I had to talk to Sensei about my extra training, he said. It was technically true, and much less embarrassing to admit. Anyo, what does your scroll say? Hinata asked. We've been comparing ours, and Kurenai-san has put a lot of detail into the plans. She didn't give me a scroll, Naruto said with a slight smile. She arranged for me to work with another Jonin in the morning. Some guy by the name of Maida Guy. Shino looked at him, and Naruto swore the skin above his glasses began to draw together, like he was frowning. I've heard of him, he's a renowned taijutsu specialist. Naruto bit his tongue before it could start bragging. If Kurenai-sensei was correct, these were not the people around which he needed to put up a false front. In a heretofore rare flash of insight, he realized that Shino might interpret Naruto's morning training with another Jonin as a sign of favoritism. I hope so, he said with a theatrical sigh. She said my taijutsu was such a mess that she didn't think she could fix it without help. Hinata just stared at him as Naruto gave a sheepish shrug. Shino's brow, however, smoothed out and he gave a thoughtful nod. Then it's good that you are both taking this so seriously. Naruto shrugged. How am I going to beat you down if I don't? He asked innocently, then began to whistle tonelessly as he walked past his teammates. We'd better get there before the noodles get cold, he said. He turned back to see Shino and Hinata exchange a wordless glance before they began walking again. The old man who ran Ichiraku always seemed pleased to see his best customer. Hey Naruto, who are your friends? He asked. Until recently, he and his daughter were the only people Naruto knew who were likely to even notice if he dropped dead in his apartment. At least, until the smell bothered the neighbors, he reminded himself. Still, if anyone deserved a smile, the gracious man about to serve the noodles surely did. Shino and Hinata had silently walked up on either side of him, so he put a hand on each of their shoulders as he answered. These are my teammates, Ichiraku-san. Well, why haven't you brought them here before? The old man asked. Well, we just became Team 8 yesterday, and we had a practice, and, Naruto explained until he noticed the man was smiling and waving his hand from side to side. Naruto, I was just joking with you. Seriously now, aren't you going to introduce your friends? Gomen, Naruto said quickly. This is Aburame Shino and Hyuga Hinata. I'm pleased to meet you both. He replied. Have a seat and I'll get you some menus. Take all the time you want to decide, we have a lot of flavors to choose from. Naruto, of course, already knew what he wanted. He used Kurenai's coupon to order a large bowl of pork ramen at half price, and after checking his wallet ordered another bowl of miso-flavored ramen. Shino ordered a bowl of beef ramen, while Hinata eventually settled on miso ramen. Everyone was quiet after the noodles arrived. Their labors seemed to have given them an appetite, because their mouths were kept too busy for conversation for a good while. Surprisingly enough, it was Shino who finally broke the silence. Our sensei was impressed by your bunshin, he said without preamble. Naruto frowned. What do you mean? The one that carried the wood up to the roof, the bug user replied cryptically. I don't think she expected to be able to hold a conversation with one. Why not? Naruto asked. If it's a copy of me, shouldn't it be able to talk? Most bunshin jutsus don't even produce solid copies, Shino explained. And while there are some that do produce copies of the user that can touch things, those copies are usually not very self-aware. At first, we thought it was you talking to us. Naruto stuck his lower lip out. So you're saying I'm so dumb that you couldn't tell the difference between me and a mindless clone? He thought he heard a sharp inhalation coming from the stool on the other side of him, where Hinata was sitting. Shino looked at him for a long moment. Your attempt at self-deprecating humor is noted, but not necessary. The thrust of my remarks was that your clones are unusually self-aware, a reflection of the degree of skill and energy used in their creation. Oh, was all Naruto could say to that. Thanks, Shino. The Aburame boy nodded gravely. Naruto finished his pork ramen and started on the miso-flavored bowl. He wondered why Kurenai-sensei hadn't said anything to him about the bunshin. He concluded that she probably didn't want him to get a swelled head and start acting like Uchiha Tem. But that didn't explain why Shino decided to bring it up on his own. Then he remembered the boy's disparaging remark yesterday after his botched attempt at Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto supposed he might have felt the need to make up for his previous comment, even though Naruto had mostly forgotten it a day later. While the boy's reserve and exceptionally quiet and precise manner were a little unusual to deal with, that same precision and rectitude would also make him a very reliable teammate. Oddly enough, Naruto found himself warming a bit toward the silent shinobi. Of course, such an introspective mood was not meant to last. Naruto's train of thought was neatly derailed when he felt a spike of killing intent coming from the street behind him. He twisted on his stool to see what was happening. Looking somewhat bruised and dirty, Kiba, Sakura, and Sasuke were walking up the street. Sakura was chattering happily about some test involving bells and Naruto felt his stomach quiver happily for an instant. Then he remembered her words on the park bench and the warm feeling died. The killing glare, of course, was coming from Sasuke. Naruto wondered if the famed Uchiha genius even figured out why Naruto had taken his place. Probably not, he concluded. For a genius, he doesn't have much imagination. Naruto returned his rival's glare and bared his teeth. He knew his slightly enlarged canines sometimes made adults a little nervous, but he didn't fully appreciate why this was so until a couple of days ago. The whole thing might have ended with an exchange of glares if Kiba hadn't asked Sasuke a question. When he didn't get an answer, the Inuzuka boy looked over at his teammate and flinched at the facial expression he saw. Kiba frowned, evidently searching for the source of Sasuke's ire. Finally he seemed to notice Naruto, seated at the counter of Ichiraku Ramen, twisted around in his seat to return Sasuke's stare. Kiba gritted his teeth and his spiky hair seemed to puff up as he stalked over toward Naruto. Do you have a problem with my teammate? He asked in a voice that was little more than a growl. Naruto didn't answer, but instead kept his eyes locked onto Sasuke's face. He did notice that the Uchiha boy's upper lip was curled, perhaps in annoyance at Kiba's interference. What is your problem? Kiba asked again, a little louder this time. Mind your own business, Naruto said, glaring back at Sasuke. Sakura had also stopped, and looked back and forth between the two of them. Kiba, Shino said reasonably as he stood up, Naruto and Sasuke have never really gotten along. We should probably just stay out of it. The dog user frowned at the bug user. Who are you to tell me what to do, Aburame? We just spent all day on Kakashi-sensei's stupid bell test, and we're the first team he's ever passed. Kiba threw out his chest with that last statement, and Shino's eyebrows became visible over his glasses. Our teacher did not make us perform any additional tests beyond a basic skills assessment, so she must be confident in our abilities. Instead, we completed our first mission today. Kiba snorted. So, just because you got an easy sensei, I got a look at her when she picked you up. She decided to go easy on you. Shino stiffened as Naruto stood up from his seat. Naruto swore he heard a low buzzing coming from somewhere nearby. Sasuke scowled at Kiba's back, but he approached the ramen stand along with Sakura. Fortunately, the Haruno girl stepped forward and grabbed Kiba's elbow. Don't you dare insult their teacher just because she's a woman. Would you want your sister to hear you say that? Or your mother? Kiba winced, seemingly in spite of himself, and Naruto had to stifle a snicker. He was a little surprised when Hinata spoke up as well. Anyo, she said, shinobi are not allowed to fight in public. I don't want to see any of us get in trouble so soon after graduating. Shino's brow furrowed, but he gave a short nod and sat back down. Right, Hinata. Sakura agreed with the girl. Leave it to the women, she sneered at Kiba as she emphasized the word, to keep their heads in a crisis. She smiled at the Hyuga girl. It's not worth any of us getting in trouble, just because Naruto Baka is too stupid to leave Sasuke alone. That last insult, so gratuitously added, was the last straw for Naruto. Sakura was playing the peacemaker here, but she still made time to insult him. Her precious Sasuke was glaring at him, while he was just trying to eat his ramen. Well, to hell with it, and to hell with them. He got up from his stool so abruptly that it fell over. He pushed past Kiba so brusquely that the larger boy took a half step backwards. Kiba reached out for Naruto's shoulder, but the smaller boy used the heel of his hand to knock Kiba's hand loose before he even had a chance to get a grip. Akamaru let out a low growl as the Inuzuka boy leaned against the wall of the restaurant. Hinata felt her jaw drop, along with her stomach, as her teammate angrily marched away. She felt almost worn away by all the emotional reversals she'd been through that day. First, Naruto's stumbling comments in the garden had mortified her, as if he was saying she made him think she was a boy. When he tried to explain what he meant, it only got worse. He seemed to be saying that she wasn't pretty or nice like the other two girls in their graduating class, but that wasn't right, or else he wouldn't seem so confused. Then he finally said that he was glad she was on his team. Hinata couldn't remember anyone ever expressing happiness at her presence, not since her mother died. His simple, heartfelt statement almost made her faint. As it was, she had to turn away because her face was blushing as red as a tomato. She'd had difficulty talking to him after that, and it wasn't until Kurenai-sensei came to help her in the kitchen that she began to organize her thoughts. Kurenai was nothing, if not observant, and she soon had Hinata explaining the whole situation. The older woman chuckled a little when the genin repeated Naruto's words. She advised Hinata in a more serious voice that any future compliments she received from the Uzumaki boy were likely to be just as heartfelt and incoherent. It was funny how her sensei seemed so sure that would happen, but Hinata knew better. She really didn't want anyone to get in trouble for fighting, especially Naruto. She suspected that he would receive more of the blame than he deserved if there was an altercation. Hinata did not miss the looks the villagers gave him as they walked together. She knew Naruto was often laughed at by the other students at the Konoha Ninja Academy. But she hadn't realized how the villagers in the street reacted to him. It seemed almost familiar, in a way. It took a while before Hinata realized that she'd seen that degree of distaste before, in the faces of the Hyuga clan elders when they talked of her failures. Still, Naruto passed through it without comment, merely returning the more virulent glares. Hinata didn't know whether to be impressed by his fortitude in the face of such dislike, or to be heartbroken that the boy didn't seem to regard it as anything unusual. Nonetheless, she feared that a public brawl would make people hate him even worse, especially since it would have involved genins from several prominent families. Between her and Sakura, they'd managed to remind the others of the rules, and at least partially diffuse the tensions between the two teams. She was grateful to the pink-haired Kunoichi, and started to shyly return the girl's smile when Sakura decided to insult Naruto and blame him for the whole situation. Sakura's attitude toward Naruto was well known to Hinata, but the white-eyed girl was surprised to see her still lash out at him while supposedly in the role of a peacemaker. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on Naruto either, because he visibly flinched, then got up from his stool so quickly that she was afraid he was going to attack someone. Instead, he just brushed past Kiba, who was also standing closer than was strictly polite. Sakura rolled her eyes and sighed. "He's always such a baby," she groused. Kiba scowled, shaking the hand that Naruto knocked away. Hinata, who'd been staring after her teammate, turned toward the other girl. The new emotion she'd started feeling on Naruto's behalf began to simmer within her. Her Byakugan activated on their own, and Hinata was surprised by a sudden desire to close all of the girl's tenketsu points. Close up, the distended blood vessels and enlarged pupils that characterized her family's advanced bloodline looked rather disturbing. Hinata had always been embarrassed about this before, but now she was secretly pleased when the Haruno girl stepped back suddenly. "What's wrong?" the girl asked. "You should not say such things to Naruto," Hinata said in a voice that was little more than a whisper. Sakura gaped at her for a moment, but then her eyes grew canny. "I understand," she said. "But just because you like him doesn't mean he isn't. I think you fail to understand," Shino interrupted, "that Naruto was wholly focused on his food until Sasuke made his presence known. His killing intent was noticeable to all of us. Your condemnation of Naruto is therefore illogical. I think you also fail to comprehend that it is possible to feel loyalty toward teammates in the absence of romantic attachment." The bug user looked from Sasuke to Kiba, ignoring the shocked silence caused by him actually speaking up. "You have my sympathies," he told the dog user in a matter-of-fact tone. Sasuke let out a HMPH, but didn't dispute anything Shino said. Hinata wrapped her fingers around the hem of her jacket. "Anyo, Shino-san, I think I've had enough ramen." Shino looked at her for a moment before nodding. He looked at the cooling remains of his beef ramen. "You are correct, it is best hot, and our meal has been interrupted." He turned to the older man and bowed, a motion Hinata quickly echoed. They left their money next to Naruto's and then Shino led the way as they left Ichiraku. As Hinata and Shino walked side by side down the street, she could hear the man's voice carrying in the late afternoon air, "I would appreciate it if you young punks would not run off my customers." It was several minutes before Hinata found her voice again. Arigato, Shino-san." Shino's head turned toward her, even as he continued to walk forward. "My observations were accurate and relevant. No thanks are necessary." Hinata absorbed this carefully as they continued down the street. "Gomen," she finally said, "but you seem to have changed your opinion regarding Naruto-kun." Shino was quiet for a moment, and Hinata worried that her question had offended the boy. "I am re-evaluating my assessment," he finally said. "Kurenai-sensei seems to bring out qualities in him that were not apparent in his conduct at the academy. A skilled observer must always be willing to challenge his preconceptions if new data contradicts." Finally, they reached an intersection where Hinata needed to turn to reach the Hyuga compound. "I will see you tomorrow," she said quietly. "At 10, Shino agreed. Hinata nodded and turned toward her home. She noticed the sky slowly darkening in the east as a warm summer evening approached Konoha. It seemed impossible that so much had happened in the span of a handful of hours, and she wondered if life would always be like that around her new friends. That thought fortified her as she walked, steeling herself for her father's inevitable questions. Naruto leapt from roof to roof as dawn began streaking the eastern sky. He flexed his left hand repeatedly, trying to work out the annoying tingles. On Kurenai-sensei's advice, he'd picked up a field alarm at one of the outfitter shops. A shinobi on a mission might desire to wake at a specific time, or to limit the amount of rest he did allow himself to take. However, a conventional alarm clock was far too noisy to use when a mission might require stealth. At some point, an extremely clever cloud shinobi devised a portable clock powered by small, but powerful batteries, charged with a simple Raiden jutsu. Instead of ringing a bell to wake its owner, the ninja clock sent a pulse of electricity through a pair of wires attached to the owner's body. Still, he did manage to make it on time, and arrived at the designated training area at the stroke of 6. Of course, what he found there immediately had him wondering if he was still asleep and dreaming. Guy Sensei, he supposed, was a large, muscular man in a green leotard. The outfit was loose on his frame, for which Naruto was grateful, and over it he wore a Chunin vest. Topping all of this was the ugliest bowl cut Naruto had ever seen. Though the one on the kid standing next to him was close competition. Standing next to Guy was a half-size duplicate that Naruto supposed was this Rock Lee person. He didn't have the vest, though he did have the orange leg warmers that matched with nothing else. After meeting Kurenai-sensei, Naruto was beginning to dislike that color for some reason. Ah, you are right on time. The man boomed in a loud voice that seemed to have no business belonging to a ninja. You must be eager to start banking the fires of your youth. Guy Sensei's idea of training consisted of Naruto and Lee sparring for nearly 2 hours straight, while he watched and nodded thoughtfully. By the end, Naruto realized that Lee was starting to take it easy on him, which actually stung his pride a little bit. That drove him to fight even harder, but every blow he landed was just further proof that Lee was holding back. Finally, the older boy went to make one of his flying spin kicks, but was just a hair slow on the launch. Instead of ducking or blocking, Naruto stepped inside the kick and sunk his left first into the boy's stomach. Lee fell down, for the first time that morning. When he got up, he was still smiling, but he nodded and Naruto realized he was breathing heavily. Yosh, Guy said, startling the genin. Kurenai was right. You will make a most challenging sparring partner for my Lee. No, Naruto said, shaking his head. I barely hit him at all. He usually didn't let his frustration show like this, but he was tired, cranky, and humiliated at how thoroughly he'd been schooled all morning. Naruto, Guy said in a disappointed voice that made Naruto want to shiver. Something about the man made his skin crawl, just a little. Don't let the fires of youth gutter out so quickly. Not many of your age can hold their own against Lee, and especially not for 2 hours. I've never seen anyone wear him down like that since he became a genin. Lee abruptly straightened and bowed. Naruto-san, we must train together. Only then will we become true geniuses of hard work. Naruto scratched his head. What the hell were these crazy people talking about? Geniuses of hard work? He asked in a dubious voice. Yes, Guy said gravely. Konoha has many geniuses. Lee's teammate Neji is considered a genius by many of the Hyugas. Uchiha Sasuke in your class was also classified as one. But it is one thing to be born a genius, to be given talent like a gift one has not earned. It is quite another to be like Lee, a genius of hard work. He has no special abilities or skills, only his own determination to be the best. His willingness to work for his goal is more valuable than being any sort of lesser genius, and will take him much farther in the end. Naruto frowned as he considered the strange Jonin's words. It pleased him, just a little, to hear Sasuke described as a lesser type of genius by someone else. But something else he said echoed Kurenai-sensei's words. A little hard work can make up for a lot, the day will come when Shino and Hinata's lives may depend on you. Mine as well. He gave a sharp nod as he made up his mind. Good. Lee. Guy barked. You still need to work on your endurance if Naruto can wear you out. Double your weights and run 5 laps around Konoha. Lee practically cheered at this announcement, which confused Naruto even more. But as the boy strapped heavy bracers to his forearms and began running, Guy took him aside to work on his forms. To flow together much better than Naruto remembered. The man's voice was almost hypnotic as he talked Naruto through all the basic taijutsu moves. He never seemed to lose patience or become distracted. It was still a little unnerving, but Naruto was more entranced by the way everything seemed to flow together. Time passed a lot quicker than Naruto realized, because they'd just finished running through all the basics when Lee staggered into the clearing, red-faced and breathing hard. So, of course, Guy immediately had them spar again. It was slightly more even this time. Lee was clearly winded, though he soon got his breathing back under control. Naruto's taijutsu was a little smoother, and he occasionally scored a glancing hit on his opponent. Lee was sweating hard, but he was still smiling as they fought. Dimly, Naruto realized that fighting when he was tired was just one more challenge for the boy, one more way to make himself a little bit better. Naruto wondered if he should start worrying when such odd people began to make sense to him. It was after 9 o'clock and both boys were considerably worse for the wear when Guy called a halt to the sparring. Naruto brushed some dirt from his sleeve. He wouldn't have time to go home and wash it before he needed to meet his team. Both he and Lee were red-faced and sweating. They both had bits of grass sticking to their uniforms from where they'd been knocked down, and their hands trembled slightly as they froze in their ready positions at Guy's command. That's enough for today, Guy said with a nod. Naruto, you should report to Kurenai. Lee and I will take a jog to cool down. I'll expect to see you here tomorrow at the same time. Naruto aped Lee's bow to his sensei, and watched with some amusement as Lee struggled to keep up the pace Guy set as they ran out of the training area. Naruto walked a little slower toward training area 19. While he didn't have time to clean up, he was really starving, especially since he hadn't even had time for a cup of instant ramen when he finally woke up that morning. Now that he'd acknowledged it, his hunger waxed rhapsodic as he made his way down the street. Most village shopkeepers were just opening up for the day, and he'd already spent over 3 solid hours training and sparring. Being groggy and half-starved, it was no surprise that his feet picked their own route, and he found himself passing Ichiraku's. Surprisingly, it was open, serving hot tea and dumplings to merchants and workers as they began their day. The old man did a slight double take when he saw Naruto approach. I'm sorry, but we haven't even started making the broth for noodles yet. Naruto tried not to let his disappointment show. Kurenai-sensei says I need to eat something besides ramen all the time, anyway, he said with a shrug. Bite your tongue. She'll put me out of business, the old man said with a laugh. You look like you've been working hard already. I've got some nice hot tea, how about some rice balls and pickles to go with it? Naruto nodded and sat down at the counter. The square plate that was soon placed in front of him was crowded with food, but he wasn't about to complain. The hot tea washed down the sticky rice and made a nice contrast with the sharp taste of the pickles. As he finished, he felt new energy flow into his limbs and knew stopping here had been a good idea. As he was finishing his tea, the old man took his plate and leaned forward a little. I'm glad I got to meet your friends last night, he said with a smile as Naruto patted his stomach. They aren't friends, so much as, Naruto began but trailed off. He wasn't completely sure what he wanted to say. They were teammates, and that was it. They're good kids, old man Ichiraku corrected him gently. He smiled ruefully. They tore those snot-nosed brats a new one after you left. Naruto wasn't sure he heard the man correctly. Nani? Yeah. The old man nodded as he collected Naruto's teacup. They really didn't seem to like the way those others talked to you. I think that little Hyuga girl gave that pink-haired one the scare of her life. Hinata? Naruto asked in disbelief. Yeah, that was her name, the old man smiled. She did something weird with her eyes. I couldn't see her do anything with her hands, but that other girl jumped back like she'd been burned. If that little girl is a Hyuga, I can see why everyone steps lightly around her clan. Naruto was confused as he thanked the man and paid for his breakfast. As he resumed his journey toward the training area, he tried to puzzle out their behavior. He didn't know why they stuck up for him, especially since he wasn't even there to see it happen. But knowing they had done so made him feel unaccountably warm. The more he thought about that, the stranger Naruto felt. He knew as he approached the training area that he needed to do something about this. Kurenai was mildly curious as to how Naruto's training session with Guy and Lee would go. She'd been tempted to look in on them, but Guy was a Jonin and his senses were particularly acute. He might take offense if he thought she was questioning his abilities, and she didn't want to do anything to jinx the deal they had struck. It was a little unusual by Konoha standards, but she felt it was the best way to get Naruto's level of proficiency up to where it should be. She felt unaccountably pressured in this respect. Perhaps it was that unknown group the Hokage mentioned, maybe it was her own instincts. Either way, she had the feeling that the sooner the boy learned how to effectively defend himself and his teammates, the better. Hinata arrived first, as seemed to be her habit. She was visibly more composed than she had been the day before. Kurenai hoped that her words, and the successful completion of their first mission, had bought the girl some peace. She hoped that sending her genins out on an obvious team bonding exercise would ease them past any potential tensions that might arise. She was particularly concerned about the Hyuga girl. If her assessment of the girl's father was accurate, she'd likely need a safe haven within the team. If she was uncomfortable with her teammates, that would not be available. The girl greeted Kurenai in her usual, hesitant manner, but from her posture, the Jonin could tell that something was wrong. Hinata, she asked as a quiet inspiration overtook her, how did dinner at Ichiraku go? Something about the girl's turmoil suggested that it was related to the boy she so admired. Hinata pressed her lips together, even as her forefingers began to push against each other. Her posture was hunched over as normal, but the quaver in her voice when she spoke was something new to Kurenai's ears. Anyo, Naruto caught up to us part of the way there. We asked him about his extra training, and he told us he was working with Guy-sensei as we walked the rest of the way. Kurenai frowned at that. She'd hoped the boy would have more sense than to brag like that, but she supposed he was still making up for what had happened in the academy. Still, she'd have to talk to him about this. Hinata took a calming breath. When Shino said he'd heard of Guy, Naruto replied that you told him his taijutsu was so bad that you didn't think you could fix it yourself. She paused for a moment, and then continued in a rush. Why did you say something like that to Naruto? He tries so hard and no one ever gives him any credit. Kurenai rocked back on her metaphorical heels, but tried not to let anything show on her face. It wasn't like she hadn't actively encouraged Hinata to assert herself when they talked, but it seemed like her words had just been wasted air. And now, this same girl was questioning her judgment where Naruto was concerned. As breakthroughs went, it was a minor thing, but Kurenai had learned as a genin to take whatever successes she could find. How she handled this was important, at least it was if she wanted Hinata to build on this. Hyuga Hinata, before I say anything else, I want you to know that I am pleased that you have taken me at my word when I said I wanted you to ask questions when you don't understand something. This was not a question I had anticipated, but I am pleased that you trust me enough to ask me about this, Kurenai concluded with a smile. That said, I would ask you if Shino had any expression on his face when he mentioned Guy-sensei. Hinata frowned in confusion. Kurenai-sensei, I did not notice anything, but, her voice trailed off. But you were focusing on Naruto as he spoke, Kurenai supplied helpfully. I ask this because that was not exactly how I described the situation to Naruto when I told him he would be working with Guy. I think he chose his words so that you and Shino would not think he was receiving favorable treatment. My arrangement with Guy is unusual among Jonin-sensei. Naruto's unusual stamina means that he can make up the time he lost at the academy faster than most. Our arrangement will facilitate this. It is because of Naruto's strengths, including his willingness to work hard, that this was done. Hinata looked more than slightly mortified. She ducked her head down again as she stuttered out, "G Gomen, Kurenai-sensei." "None of that, Hinata," Kurenai said sharply. "Your loyalty to your teammate is commendable, and I specifically instructed you to ask me questions like this. At some point, you may become an advisor to a village leader or Anbu captain. Under those circumstances, not speaking up would be an abandonment of your duties. I am also glad to hear that Naruto was considerate of the feelings of his teammates when a potentially uncomfortable subject was raised. Naruto is never cruel," Hinata said quickly, then stopped and swallowed. "No, he isn't," Kurenai agreed, "but he doesn't always realize when he's giving offense to others, does he? But he means well, and that counts for a lot. All he has to do is just learn to think in another's place, part of seeing, underneath the underneath. You have just given me proof that he is making progress in that area, and for that I thank you." Hinata's cheeks pinked and she nodded in acknowledgement. Kurenai frowned at her and decided to take a stab in the dark. Something else happened, though, didn't it? Hinata let out a sigh and began describing the confrontation with Team 7. Kurenai nodded thoughtfully, smiling when Hinata related the warm greeting Ichiraku's proprietor had given them. She'd have to find an excuse to talk to the man at some point. Naruto might just be a regular customer to the man, but it wouldn't do to make assumptions. She did raise her palm at one point to ask a question. "Are you quite sure you felt the killing intent coming from Sasuke before Naruto turned around?" Hinata nodded quickly. "Good," Kurenai said with a smile. "I am glad he did not do anything to provoke Uchiha. I'll be having words with Kakashi about controlling his students if anyone tries to make something of this." However, Yuichi Kurenai was highly annoyed by the time Hinata was finished with her story. "I almost hope the owner of Ichiraku does file a complaint against them for interfering with his customers," she growled. She frowned at her student. "Hinata, you did nothing worse than standing up for your teammate. Activating your Byakugan, consciously or not, is not an offensive action by itself." Sakura did not look like she expected that, did she? Hinata slowly shook her head. "I don't understand why she can be so cruel to Naruto-kun," she said. The honorific barely whispered, but Kurenai's ears were sharp. The Jonin cleared her throat. "I think it's because she's a silly, shallow girl. She chases after Sasuke for the same reasons many of the other kunoichi do, and she cannot appreciate the subtle qualities of others." "Subtle qualities?" her student asked. "Most people see Naruto and dismiss him as a prankster or worse," Kurenai replied, skating around the edges of the Hokage's law. "You've told me yourself that you appreciate his cheerful nature and how he always keeps trying, no matter what. Those are actually very good qualities for a shinobi to have. It is wrong that you are the first person to notice this. Aside from Yumi no Iruka, I don't have a lot of respect for the teachers at the Konoha Ninja Academy." Hinata's pale eyes widened at this admission. Kurenai knew she was laying it on a little thick, but Hinata's tendency to second-guess herself was holding her back. That vague sense of urgency she felt was also pushing her to become less circumspect in her dealings with the girl. "Honestly," Kurenai continued, "I think you see Naruto better than many. And he needs people that understand him more than you know. Between you and me," she said, lowering her voice in a conspiratorial manner, "I think he needs friends as well as teammates. Would you like to be more than just his teammate?" Kurenai phrased the last question innocently enough, and she suppressed a grin as Hinata's face immediately went bright red. Her suspicions confirmed, she looked up at the morning sky as her student collected herself. Hyuga Hiyashi might very well die of apoplexy if he knew what she'd just learned, but that was far too kind of fate for him. I would like to be his friend," Hinata finally said. "Good. I think you are making an excellent start," Kurenai said. Just keep in mind that he hasn't had many people defend him over the years, so he may not understand why you do it. She didn't add that it was sad that this was the case, as sad as the fact that Hinata had no experience with being appreciated or complimented. Sometimes Kurenai felt like she was a medic nin in a ward full of broken bodies, only what she was trying to repair here was harder to heal than mere flesh. She was broken out of this reverie by Shino's arrival. The Aburame boy was as quiet and expressionless as ever, but Kurenai could almost feel his attention shift back and forth between herself and Hinata. Hinata informed me about the altercation last night, she said. Shino appeared to straighten slightly inside his long coat, but it might have been Kurenai's mind picking up subtler indications and filling in the blanks for her. Our conduct was within the guidelines set forth for shinobi at the academy, he said, a little stiffly. Kurenai nodded. And I was about to compliment you both on your handling of the situation. Shino nodded in turn, accepting her implied criticism of his defensiveness. Will there be repercussions from this? He asked. Only for them. Your conduct was above reproach, all of you, even Naruto. He left while being insulted, rather than retaliate. That speaks highly of his maturity, of all your maturity, Kurenai added. Then her expression hardened. If there is an inquiry of any sort, I will deal with it, and make whoever raised it sorry to have done so. Shino stood there for a moment, and Kurenai could almost hear the gears turning behind those dark glasses of his. Finally, he nodded again. Kurenai felt like the boy was still forming his own opinions of her as well as his teammates. She wasn't sure whether her last statement would move him positively or negatively, but she guessed the former to be the case. After all, logic would maintain that they had followed the Konoha Shinobi Code of Conduct to the letter, and logic was something Shino, like many Aburames, seemed to inordinately prize. I would suggest, she said, that we not mention this incident to Naruto unless he brings it up. They were his classmates and it was him that was being targeted, so it may not be a comfortable subject, but if you can bring this sort of cohesiveness to our field missions, they will become much easier to accomplish. What was that about missions? Naruto asked as he landed in the middle of the clearing. Kurenai felt her blood change to ice. Her student had discarded the uniform Ikitaro had spent so much effort altering the previous day. Instead, he was wearing a bright green leotard that bunched up in odd places on his small frame. The burnt umber leg warmers were there as well, with the toes of his sandals barely poking out of the fabric pooled around his ankles. Topping it off, his hair had been unevenly dyed black, so some of it was ebony, some bits were still blonde, and gray-yellow streaks abounded. It had also been hued, apparently with a dull kunai, into a crude approximation of a very distinctive bowl cut. Guy had practically sworn not to do this. Naruto wasn't supposed to make major changes to his equipment without consulting her. She'd taken so damn many precautions, only to see this, after only one training session. She didn't know how her kunai had gotten into her hand, all she knew was that it felt very, very right somehow. I am going to kill Guy in his sleep, she snarled. He promised me. No, I'm going to just sever his spinal cord and let him live as a quadriplegic. Naruto had taken a step back, as did her other startled genins. He seemed to be having some sort of difficulty moving, or was it breathing? Abruptly, he bent forward and his legs buckled. His rear end hit the ground and there was a loud pop and a puff of smoke. When it cleared, Naruto was lying curled up on the ground, in his new uniform, holding his stomach and laughing until tears began to leak from his eyes. Kurenai stared at her student, realizing that she'd just been had. She'd been so shocked by Naruto's appearance that she hadn't even thought to check for a henge. He'd conned her, and quite skillfully under the circumstances. She tried to keep a straight face, but the corner of her mouth kept twitching as she stared at her genin. Naruto sat up abruptly, as if he felt her eyes boring into him. He scratched at the back of his head and tried to stifle his laughter. I promised I wouldn't pull any more pranks in the village, but I didn't say I'd completely stop, he explained in a sheepish tone. Kurenai gave it up as a lost cause and let out a bark of laughter, something that hadn't been heard in Konoha for many years. She saw her other genin's eyes widen as she laughed along with the blonde-haired prankster. Very good, Naruto. I hadn't extracted a completely binding promise from you, had I? She asked rhetorically. Now, do you know why your little joke worked so well? Naruto sat up straighter and frowned. Hinata had a faint smile on her face, no doubt from seeing Naruto fully recovered from the previous night. Shino was, well, Shino. Naruto shook his head. Kurenai kneeled on the ground, getting comfortable and motioned for the others to do the same. That was a very realistic henge, but normally, I can see through a henge a block away. I am a genjutsu specialist after all. But I didn't immediately think to check. Why was that? Naruto frowned, concentrating, but it was Shino who spoke up first. You were clearly agitated by the apparent changes to his appearance. This obviously interfered with conducting logical thought processes. Kurenai nodded. That's part of the answer. From what you said earlier, about when you said I'd still be your student, Naruto said slowly, you repeated that several times, but it didn't make sense until I'd seen Lee. Then I understood that if Guy made Lee dress like him, you might be afraid he'd do the same with me, he concluded, shuddering at the thought. Exactly. And if I was afraid it would happen, then I obviously considered it to be at least remotely possible, correct? Kurenai asked. Shino spoke up. So he showed you something you at least partially expected to see, and made sure that it was sufficiently upsetting that you would react without thinking first. He summarized. Exactly, Kurenai agreed. Now, while this was a good prank, you can also apply those principles on missions, can't you? What followed was a rather stimulating discussion on using misdirection and knowledge of the enemy's emotional hot buttons, both on the battlefield and to accomplish mission objectives. The latter was more applicable for a reconnaissance team, but all three of her genins contributed to the discussion. Hinata had evidently been paying attention in her classes, for she was able to effortlessly recall details from various famous missions they'd studied at the academy. Naturally, Shino settled into a role as the critic for their various strategies, picking apart their plans and exposing every weakness. Uzumaki Naruto was as creative as his additions to the Hokage monument suggested. What was surprising was his ability to put together a plan almost instantly when presented with a situation and an objective. Kurenai slowly began to realize that Naruto's pranks had given him a thorough grounding in operational planning that many shinobi 3 times his age lacked. For the most part, Kurenai would simply present them with a situation, then sit back and watch them hash it out. Sometimes it would take Naruto several attempts to come up with a plan that Shino would approve. Hinata stayed out of the discussions at first. She turned pink and looked down immediately after correcting Shino regarding the range of a sand country hunting boomerang. That interruption did not pass unnoticed by either boy, and soon they were working on drawing her into the planning sessions, usually by asking her specific questions. By the end of the hour, her genins' heads appeared to be buzzing with all the new thoughts and ideas they'd assimilated. Despite herself, Kurenai was a little impressed by the way they'd worked together on her hypothetical problems. She'd spent several hours last night looking up incidents that had occurred over the last 75 years, and memorizing enough details that she could relay it naturally and without anyone realizing they were being tested. She'd expected them to take at least 3 sessions to work through the fruits of her labors, not 1. Nonetheless, she smiled to herself as they began walking toward the Hokage's tower to receive a mission. It wasn't often that she misread people like that, and it was even rarer for her to be positively surprised. Her genin team was a bit more intelligent than she'd anticipated, and that was a good thing. She idly wondered why she'd been so resistant to taking on apprentices when her bitter memories supplied the answer. Unbidden, she saw her students' forms overlaid with ghosts from the past. Hinata was replaced with a slender, red-eyed Kunoichi with a far more aggressive attitude. Shino was replaced by the equally pragmatic, but even more hard-headed Nomaru. And Naruto, the village pariah, was replaced by another young shinobi, also hated by some for something he had no control over. Matai was there, his pale eyes in sharp contrast with his heavily tanned face and unruly black hair. The ghosts of her childhood walked before her, and Kurenai wondered if she looked into a mirror, would she see the imposing figure of Kobaru-sensei in place of her own? It was a fortunate thing that a Jonin must possess iron self-control. It was a blessing that the shinobi code would allow no trace of her anguish to show on her face. It was a curse that she would walk behind her team, letting them find their own paths, but always watching their backs and swearing to herself, never again. All of this as her mind relived those painful memories, along with bittersweet remembrances of a boy she once thought she might have loved. Ooh. With creative use of Kage Bunshin, Kikai bugs, and Hinata's all-seeing eyes, Naruto and his teammates began regularly clearing out 2D ranked missions every afternoon. As long as they finished their first mission quickly, the Hokage was happy to oblige them when they returned to the tower. Kurenai-sensei was also correct about how the money would accumulate from doubling up on missions. Naruto soon paid Ikitaro the tailor another visit, and ordered a duplicate uniform made to the same specifications. It would be nice not having to do laundry every night to keep from stinking. He even thought about buying a small washing machine. Such thoughts were especially attractive since he got pretty dirty every morning. If anything, the pace of the workouts with Lee and Guy-sensei grew even more intense. Naruto was frustrated that he couldn't build up calluses and scar tissue on his knuckles like Lee could. He tried to hit the training logs just as hard as his rival, and he always finished with bloody knuckles, but after they healed the skin refused to harden up. Eventually he gave up and just wore his fingerless gloves, trying to do as much damage as possible to the thick wood. Under Guy-sensei's careful guidance, Naruto's taijutsu form slowly improved. Now he found himself rarely losing his footing when sparring with Lee, and almost never against Shino or Hinata. Speed, however, was still a sore point with Naruto. No matter what he tried, he couldn't ever seem to match Rock Lee in that department. Guy assigned him to wear some leg weights, and Naruto obeyed, though he attached twice as many as he was instructed to. He was so frustrated that he wanted to get better as rapidly as possible. Of course, the first time he tried to leap onto a rooftop after doing this, he ran face first into a wall. Kurenai-sensei pulled him aside after he showed up for a team meeting barely able to walk. That was when she explained why it was better to gradually increase the weights, so he could get used to them. A sudden increase in his burden would merely keep him from moving as freely, which would be counterproductive in the long run. Sure enough, once he reduced his load and began moving a little more freely, the increases in speed and strength sped up as well. Nonetheless, his morning sparring sessions with Lee consisted of the other boy running rings around him at first, until eventually Naruto could tire him out and get the fight onto a more even footing. It was humbling to realize that if they ever fought for real, his only hope would be to fight totally defensively and hope Lee didn't strike a decisive blow before he could wear the spandex-clad ninja down. Of course, that knowledge, galling as it was, only spurred Naruto to work harder, and increase his weights whenever he began to move a little easier. Against Shino, Naruto's efforts were a little more gratifying. The larger boy still had reach on him, but Naruto's corrected stances were stable enough that he could block his teammates' attacks without falling or being shoved off balance. The weights made it harder to block fast enough, but the increased mass was gratifying when he snapped his forearm around properly and knocked Shino's arm completely out of line. The bug user's eyebrows rose above the tops of his dark glasses as Naruto spun inside his guard and lightly slapped his stomach with a textbook-perfect reverse punch. Not a word was exchanged as they slid back into ready positions for the next round, but the nod Shino gave him was oddly respectful, more like a subtle bow, and Naruto responded with a tight grin, though he really wanted to shout out loud. Naruto was also secretly glad that he had not run into certain other people as well. They'd heard through the rumor mill that Team 7 had been given a C-rank mission after Kiba pitched a fit about being asked to catch the cat belonging to the Fire Lord's wife for the third time. Now, Kiba, Sasuke, and Sakura were out of town for an unspecified period of time, escorting some bridge builder. Naruto really wouldn't miss Sasuke, or even Kiba. Sakura, it was weird how he'd still get that light feeling when he saw her, no matter how nasty she'd been to him the last time. That light feeling would last until she said something, or until she started fawning on Sasuke, or do something else to remind him of exactly how much she didn't care for him. He didn't understand how he could want to see her, but still hate how she made him feel afterward. Maybe he deserved it in some way, so it was only right that it would happen like that. Of course, now it wouldn't happen for a while now, all over a tantrum about a mission to retrieve a cat. Naruto didn't understand what the big deal about that cat was. Of course, after the first time they'd caught it, Shino left one of his smaller bugs concealed under its collar. He and members of his personal colony can apparently smell each other from blocks away, so after that it took maybe half an hour to narrow down the errant feline's location. Naruto's presence was usually enough to flush the pampered pet, who seemed unusually agitated whenever he was around. On the other hand, it would usually run straight to Hinata and beg to be picked up. The white-eyed girl would oblige, and stroke the fur around its ears while they returned it. Naruto thought it was kind of funny how easily the finicky cat took to his teammate, but when he asked Hinata if she had any pets, she just looked down and became extremely quiet. He wanted to ask Kurenai if she knew what was going on, but when he caught her eye she was frowning as well. Uzumaki Naruto wasn't the most observant shinobi in the leaf, but he wasn't stupid. Well, not completely stupid anyway. His white-eyed teammate wasn't just quiet. At times, something would seem to set her off and she'd just seem to disappear, shrinking in on herself and refusing to make a sound. Try as he might, he couldn't see any pattern to when this happened. He remembered when he tried to compliment her in the herbalist's garden, and how she pretty much refused to talk to him after that. Yet that same evening, she'd reportedly gone off on Sakura for saying something nasty about him. It just didn't make any sense. Even for a girl. Of course, that meant he had no idea what to do. He knew his own issues with that damned fox sealed behind his navel tended to make him react oddly at times, but no one bound a demon to Hinata, so he had no idea what was wrong. It was very confusing, so he tried to not make a big deal out of it. He just wished he knew what Kurenai-sensei was being so close-mouthed about. After completing their 30th mission, yet another cat retrieval, Kurenai-sensei did not lead them back to the Hokage's tower for another mission. You three have been working very hard, and I'm quite pleased with your progress, so we will take a break this afternoon and relax, she said with a smile. With that, she led them through the village to a cluster of buildings that looked vaguely familiar to Naruto. But it wasn't until the sign became visible that he realized she was taking them to Moritake's. Ooh, Kurenai smiled as she led her team into her favorite restaurant. They'd been working hard the past 2 weeks, between missions, sparring, group lessons, and their individual training. She could see from the effects it had on their performance that none of them had been slacking on the latter. At the same time, she became concerned she might be pushing too hard, and risking burnout of some sort. That was the excuse Asuma used when she asked him about the training regimen he used with his team. Mostly it seemed to consist of him playing Go with the Nara kid, while the other two looked bored. Or the 4 of them eating at Asuma's favorite yakitori place. He seemed to think that just putting Nara, Akamichi, and Yamanaka together on one team was enough to ensure success. Kurenai knew better. Success and survival were never to be taken for granted. Moritake himself looked up from the bar as they walked in. Kurenai, Naruto, come in, come in. This must be the rest of your team. Kurenai smiled and introduced Shino and Hinata to the retired shinobi turned restaurant owner. Soon they were seated at a table in the corner, where a waitress took their orders. Shino looked from her to Naruto and back again before speaking. Logically, this would be an establishment that you are familiar with. But how did he know Naruto? Kurenai resisted the urge to grimace. You couldn't train kids to look underneath, for years and not expect them to do so at inconvenient times. After our first team meeting, I took Naruto here to discuss some issues that had come up. I see, Shino said in a neutral tone, then took a sip of his tea. Kurenai's eyes cut over to Naruto, who was looking a little uncomfortable. Hinata just stared down as if studying her plate. No, I'm not sure you do, she said in a reasonable tone. Naruto doesn't like to make a big deal of it, but I don't think you are aware of the extent of the supplemental training he has taken on. Naruto's face reddened a little, but now Hinata was looking up, evidently interested in the direction the conversation had taken. Shino just gazed at his sensei, his facial features settled into his neutral mask. Shino refused to show any overt emotion, but she was fairly sure the bug user was bothered by a seeming favoritism on her part toward his teammate. He seemed to respect logic, so she would lay her cards on the table in a logical fashion. We came here to discuss his role within the team, and the measures that would be necessary for him to fill it. He agreed to replace his uniform, at his own cost, for something better suited to our probable mission profiles. He is also undergoing the most comprehensive training program out of the three of you. Every morning, he gets up at 5 and meets with Maida Guy and his student for taijutsu training from 6 until 9. Then he meets with us for team training at 10. Between training and missions, we are usually together until 5 or 6 in the afternoon. After that, he stays at training area 19 and practices alone with his jutsus and chakra control exercises. What time do you go home each night, Naruto? Be honest. I usually quit and go to Ichiraku's around 9 or so, he answered in a low voice. What have I told you about eating ramen too often? Kurenai chided him with a smile. Naruto acted embarrassed, but that only made her point for her. Anyway, I was asking him to basically commit to working 15-hour days, so I needed to ask about several things, including his willingness to work such a schedule. Shino nodded slowly. I admit I was curious as to the true extent of his extra training. He purposefully made light of it when we discussed it earlier. Given Naruto's improvements, I would probably also benefit from extra taijutsu training, but I currently spend most of my mornings and evenings working on the Kikai colonies at home. Kurenai was sure there was a regretful note in the boy's usual monotone. I understand that, Kurenai agreed. Your family's unique abilities are based on your affinities with the colonies you host. Your father made me aware that they were entering a delicate phase in their breeding program. I'm sure the long-term benefits will more than make up for any delays in your training. Shino nodded again but didn't speak. Kurenai tried not to let any relief show on her face. The last thing she needed was any jealousy or perceived favoritism poisoning the atmosphere between her genins. The problem with Shino was that he didn't give her a lot of information to work with. He was normally so restrained and emotionless that the normal warning signs were usually absent. But as Kobaru-sensei once said, still waters often run the deepest, and it was a mistake to assume the boy behind the emotionless shinobi mask was without feelings of his own. Kurenai's musings were interrupted by a hesitant voice. Anyo, Hinata said. I would like to take extra training, if I can. I know I have a lot that I need to work on, and I need a lot of extra effort to be as good as I need to be. Kurenai considered the girl for a moment. While she damned Hiashi for systematically destroying the girl's sense of worth, his actions seemed to have given her motivation to work harder, rather than just giving up. It was too bad her father was too stupid to see her stubborn determination and acknowledge it for what it was. I appreciate your desire to improve, Hinata, but I don't think the morning sessions with Guy would be much help to you. They are working on standard taijutsu forms, not Jiyuken. The styles are so different that you would be relearning everything from step 1. I also hate to mention this, but I think your father would have strong objections to you learning another style, at least for now. Kurenai considered her next words as she watched the girl's face fall. She supposed Hinata couldn't help but take it as a rejection. Everything in her world was probably rooted in the rejections from her remaining parent. Even if she understood it, Kurenai still found it painful to watch. On the other hand, I think you should work on your individual exercises in the morning. After our team meetings are over, you can always stay late and work with Naruto. If someone had suddenly whisked Hyuga Hinata away, and left an alabaster statue sitting in her place, Kurenai doubted it would have looked much different. Kurenai turned toward Naruto, who looked a little surprised. You two are about the same size, so you make good sparring partners, at least for right now. You can show her some of the things you are learning from Guy. Hinata also has excellent chakra control, and that's one of your weaknesses. I think both of you can benefit from working together. Do either of you have any objections? She asked innocently. She felt slightly guilty for putting them on the spot like this, but the better she got to know the two of them, the more she felt a stronger friendship between them would do them both good. Hinata needed to absorb some of Naruto's confidence, and Naruto needed acceptance. He was still afraid to tell anyone who didn't already know about his prisoner. Kurenai felt, given her reactions, that Hinata was the least likely person to reject him if she found out. Still, it was a calculated risk. She didn't know what Naruto would do if he did finally trust someone, only to be betrayed. The worst-case scenario was, well, disastrous. Not that it would be anything worse than this village seemed to deserve, claimed a traitorous thought welling up from the bitterness of her past. She dismissed that sentiment as unworthy of her, and unworthy of the memories of those lost. She looked from Naruto to Hinata and back again. If she was wrong, the village would live or die on the merits of its youngest generation, and perhaps that was as it should be. Wars were usually decided in a similar manner, weren't they? Do either of you object to working together? She asked archly. No, Naruto said quickly. Kurenai remembered how upset he'd been after Hinata reacted so strongly to his compliment at the herbalist's house. He was still fearful of upsetting her again, which wasn't really a bad thing. Hinata had few enough people in her life who were considerate of her feelings. Of course, that could be used both ways. Hinata, I understand if your father would not approve. If you don't think you can do this, Naruto understands, Kurenai said. It's not like you'll hurt his feelings, she added innocently. Naruto nodded calmly, but Hinata's face took on a trapped expression. I will be happy to train with Naruto. She stammered quickly, confirming Kurenai's assessment. As nervous as she was, Hinata was more afraid of giving offense, or doing something that could be seen as hurtful to Naruto. Good, it's settled. You two can start tomorrow. If your father has any questions, Hinata, please tell him to direct them to me. But let's not go borrowing trouble, all right? Hinata nodded. Kurenai doubted Hyuga Hiyashi would even notice unless someone brought it to his attention. He was evidently very involved in training the girl's younger sister, Hanabi. There was already buzz around the Jonin ranks about another possible Hyuga genius being considered for an early admission to the Konoha Ninja Academy. Even if he did object, custom mandated that, even as Kurenai was powerless to interfere in his daughter's home life, Hiyashi was similarly powerless to interfere with her genin's training regimen. The next day, Team 8 performed no missions at all. Instead, they were joined by two newcomers to Training Area 19. Kurenai watched Naruto lead Rock Lee and a brown-haired girl into the clearing to join them. Tenten was a pretty genin, a year older than Kurenai's students, with her long hair done up in an elaborate double bun that kept it up and out of her way. As they entered the clearing, she was twirling a kunai and telling Naruto about a sword her father was designing. When they saw Kurenai, Tenten and Lee immediately moved to stand before her and bow. Thank you for allowing us to attend this training session, Tenten said in a respectful voice as she straightened up. Lee didn't say anything, but nodded vigorously. Kurenai blinked, a little disconcerted by their extreme politeness. That's all right, I'm happy to have you here. Naruto has improved so much working with Lee and your sensei. Tenten nodded. He's really sped up. Guy sensei has me come by every so often for target practice, and I can barely hit him now. Target practice? Kurenai asked curiously. Hi, Lee said abruptly. It's to test our reflexes. Naruto-san and I are the targets and Tenten-san practices. Kurenai blinked. Blunted kunais, Tenten said quickly. They don't draw blood. Well, not much anyway. I don't let her hit me in the face anymore, Naruto said innocently. I see, Kurenai said in a distant voice. Well, let's get started. She motioned for them to sit. A genjutsu is a construct, composed of chakra, designed to deceive the senses. As she began with the standard academy introduction, Kurenai considered her audience. Shino was as impassive as ever, but she got a sense that his attention was unusually focused today, whether by the visitors, or by the subject matter was debatable. Hinata hadn't said a word since the newcomers arrived. Her Byakugan could see through most genjutsus because the chakra would be directly visible to her. But she still paid close attention to the lecture. Kurenai wondered if she was aware of the small number of advanced techniques that could deceive the Hyuga bloodline, if she expected her eyes to fail her when it counted most, or if she was just being polite. Naruto was mostly focused on her words, though he did fidget a little as she talked. For someone as energetic as the blonde shinobi, that was almost inevitable. In addition to being excruciatingly polite, Guy's students were most attentive. Lee frowned a lot as she talked. She wondered if he was having difficulty following the material, since he probably hadn't studied genjutsus much since discovering he couldn't mold the chakra necessary to create one. Tenten, on the other hand, was almost starry-eyed. It took a while for Kurenai to understand why she had such an odd expression on her face. From what she'd heard, the girl was one of the more formidable new kunoichis, deadly accurate with thrown weapons, and no slouch with melee weapons either. Still, she was on a team with a male Jonin and two boys, one of whom was the Hyuga prodigy. It was likely that she'd questioned, at least once or twice, if a woman could be a successful ninja and advance to the Jonin rank. Girls were a noticeable minority at the academy, and the disparity only became more pronounced at the higher ranks. Kurenai realized, with an uncomfortable lurch, that the girl probably idolized her for her apparent success. Yuahi Kurenai's multitasking capabilities were put to the test as she sorted out her feelings and concluded the textbook explanation of her art. While she had made the rank of Jonin, she didn't consider herself any sort of success, let alone a role model. She'd simply had the dumb luck to survive a situation that killed her betters, and then been unable to find conclusive evidence as to why it had happened. Not that she needed it. She knew why it happened. But the Hokage couldn't act without proof, and for something like this, she'd need unassailable proof, because the villagers wouldn't want to believe it, wouldn't want to act. And so he got away with it. And she was left to pick up the pieces of her life. To find another team, but never get close to them. To pass the rank exams, but never feel successful after that one awful failure. Part of her wanted to pull that starry-eyed girl off to the side and scream into her ear. Tell her to stop looking to the future and to look around instead. Tell her to cherish her teammates and her friends, because they could all be taken away in the blink of an eye. But she couldn't do that. She'd frighten the girl, and she'd probably talk. Word might get around, and the one who did this to her, the one responsible for so much. He would know, and it might please him to know how deeply he'd scarred her. She'd rather die first. Instead, she wrapped up her description of the theory. Are there any questions? She asked. When no one moved, she continued. Now, as for identifying when you are being affected by a genjutsu, remember it is limited by two things: the amount of chakra used, and the creator's imagination. Both of those factors mean that not every element of the illusion will be perfect. There's only a finite amount of chakra that can be used to create the sensory overlay, and it can't include anything the creator didn't think of. That means if you act or focus on things the creator didn't anticipate, you are more likely to notice discrepancies. Once your mind seizes on these differences, the battle is mostly won. You aren't fooled anymore, and now all you need to do is push back the curtain that has been drawn before you. Noting the nodding heads before her, Kurenai posed a question. One commonly known method of disrupting a genjutsu is to wound yourself. The sudden pain can shock the senses and disrupt the overlay. But this is hardly an elegant solution, as someone in a dangerous situation hardly needs to be mutilating themselves. How else do you think this can be accomplished? Shino spoke up first. Logically, if it is a chakra-based energy construct, the genjutsu can be disrupted by the application of a similar form of energy. That is correct, Kurenai agreed, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. What is an easier way to free oneself from such a construct? Lee and Naruto looked puzzled, and Tenten frowned. Surprisingly, Hinata hesitantly raised her hand. Anyo, if the construct is anchored to your personal chakra, would it be easier to just disrupt the anchors, rather than the whole thing? That's very close, Kurenai agreed. You can temporarily remove what the genjutsu is anchored to. It's tricky if you don't have good chakra control, but if you can suppress your own chakra circulation for a split second, the genjutsu will instantly fall away from you. This is a lot easier than trying to shatter a chakra construct that might have been made by someone considerably more powerful than you are. With that, she demonstrated the seals, and with a sharp intake of breath, suppressed her chakra circulation to zero. Instantly, the sunlight dimmed, the sound of birdsong became fainter, and the feel of the warm sun on her face was muted. She blew out the breath, released her chakra, and everything quickly went back to normal. She had each of them practice by themselves, then with her standing next to them, maintaining a blindness genjutsu on them. Hinata and, surprisingly, Lee picked it up immediately. After figuring out what they were doing wrong, Shino and Tenten soon mastered the technique. Unfortunately, Naruto was never able to completely suppress his chakra. Kurenai suspected the Yondaime's seal and/or his tenant was the reason, but she couldn't discuss it in front of others. She had to settle for a sympathetic look as Naruto grumbled and sulked. Kurenai-sensei? Hinata asked, glancing at Naruto. Is there a way to remove a genjutsu from another person? Kurenai did not miss the look she sent Naruto's way, but the boy was too busy sulking to pay attention just yet. Well, there is, but it's a little trickier, Kurenai agreed. Shino hit upon the principle earlier. You have to disrupt the chakra in the genjutsu itself. The easiest way to do this is to draw in your chakra and push it down toward your hara, right below your navel. You collect as much as you can, and compress it into as tight a sphere as possible. Visualize it like a ball being squeezed and compressed from every direction. Once you have it packed as tightly as possible, release it all at once. Won't that, hurt? Hinata asked nervously. Not really, Kurenai assured her. 1. It is very difficult to gather a lot of energy that way. Also, it's still your chakra. It's attuned to your body, and until it's aspected by a jutsu, it will just pass through your cells without damaging them. I can see how that might push away a genjutsu anchored to me, but how will that help someone else? Tenten asked curiously. Another very good question, Kurenai acknowledged with a nod. When the chakra leaves your body, it will form a pulse, almost like a shockwave, that will extend a small distance, based upon how much chakra is used. That pulse can also disrupt any genjutsu it encounters. However, it's difficult to generate enough power to make the pulse extend any great distance. Thus, you may have to be very close to the person you are trying to free, she concluded, ignoring the blush that suddenly spread across Hinata's face. With that, Kurenai had them practice the harder method. Unsurprisingly, Lee could not perform this method at all. Tenten could do it, but the pulse only extended a few inches from her skin. Hinata concentrated for several moments, then released a chakra pulse that extended over 2 feet from her body, after which she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Kurenai didn't often think about the Kyuubi. It was locked away, sealed inside Naruto. It gave him unnatural stamina and the hatred of the villagers, but it didn't control his mind or his soul. She was far more concerned with her student as a person than as a strategic asset. So it could be understood how she overlooked the effects her instructions would have on the vessel that contained the 9-tailed fox. It wasn't until the frustrated genin began to concentrate and an actually visible haze of blue chakra appeared around him, tinted purple at the edges, that the implications sank in. Kurenai opened her mouth to tell him to stop when he released the chakra pulse. She instinctively threw up her hands as the energy washed over her. Her skin tingled and all the hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention, but there were no truly adverse effects. The air was filled with sound as the trees around them emptied of birds. Turning and looking across the clearing, Kurenai could see flocks of birds taking wing in the distance, and the faint shimmer in the air meant the pulse was still traveling. She turned back around and saw everyone staring at Naruto. Tenten's mouth was hanging open, but Lee was giving him a verses for victory sign. Shino's eyebrows were clearly visible above his sunglasses. Hinata's Byakugan were activated, and the expression on her face bordered on awe. Naruto gave his sensei a sheepish grin and shrugged as he scratched the back of his head. Kurenai sighed. I suppose if you aren't good at chakra suppression, you'd make up for it with chakra expression. We should try to finish this lesson before the Anbu get here to find out what happened. The Hokage was more amused than anything else once he learned the full story that evening. Kurenai was mortified when she discovered how large an area Naruto had affected. Nearly a quarter of the village had felt the chakra pulse. It hadn't hurt anyone or damaged anything, as long as you didn't count the dignity of the wives of a few village elders. Kurenai was secretly annoyed at the frivolous uses some made of her art, so having one's cosmetic illusions stripped away suddenly seemed a just comeuppance. Fortunately, no one would learn of Naruto's involvement in their less than private humiliations. All they would know was that a test involving an experimental jutsu had gone awry, affecting a large area. To his credit, once she reported the basic facts, the Hokage was more interested in Naruto's development. I suppose it's best, he concluded, that if he can't use one method to break a genjutsu, then the alternative would work even better for him. I'd say a bit more than better. Kurenai disagreed in a respectful voice. I felt that pulse. He could disrupt every genjutsu user in a battle with one technique. Ours as well as theirs, the Hokage gently reminded her. We can work out a signal so friendly forces would know to expect it. I'm just wondering what else he can learn to do, Kurenai said. She sighed. So much time wasted at the academy, being ignored. But he's determined to make up for lost time now. How is he doing, aside from his studies? The Hokage asked. Better, Kurenai said after a moment's thought. He seems to have struck up a friendly rivalry with Guy's student Rock Lee. They spar for hours every morning, so it's not unexpected. He and Shino get along, though it's sometimes hard to tell with the Aburame boy. He's as quiet and close-mouthed as any of his family. As for Hinata, her voice trailed off. I think she may suspect his secret now. She's far more intelligent than anyone gives her credit for, and those eyes, she had them activated and was staring at him after he released that pulse. I think she suspects something. The Hokage frowned. That is worrisome. I suppose we could arrange to have her moved. On the contrary, Kurenai said quickly. I think it's the best thing that could happen. The Hokage stared at Kurenai for so long that she began to feel a little nervous. But she couldn't let him do anything to disrupt what she'd spent so long building towards. I'm not sure I understand your reasoning, he finally said. Naruto has been isolated all of his life. He's been alone as long as he can remember, and now, thanks to Mizuki, he knows why. You and I can tell him it's not his fault until we're blue in the face, but it won't matter if everyone else who knows treats him like a monster. With all due respect, Hokage-sama, right now your law is slowly killing him. No one his age knows the truth, and he feels like once he tells them, they will turn on him like their parents have. All the burdens are on him, and right now he's so overloaded he can't even take the first step. He's gladly working 15-hour days because it gives him something else to think about, gives him something he actually has control over. Kurenai looked over at her superior. His eyes were squeezed shut like he was in pain, and his face had a peculiar grayish tinge to it. His pipe sat forgotten and extinguished near the corner of his desk. Kurenai felt a sudden stab of pity for the old man, but she knew she had to make her point before he did something to ruin things. To break him out of this destructive cycle of belief, she continued, 3 things have to happen. First, someone of his generation has to figure out what happened. With your law in effect, that's a tricky proposition. Second, they have to confront Naruto and let him know they know something's wrong. Finally, they have to accept him as he is. And you believe this Hyuga girl can do this? The Hokage whispered. Kurenai nodded. I believe she's our best chance. She's intelligent, well-read, and, well, she likes the boy. She was mortified yesterday at the thought of something she said hurting his feelings. She's also volunteered for extra training with Naruto, they're probably sparring as we speak. The Hokage nodded, though his eyes were still troubled. So much was done with the best of intentions, yet we only end up hurting the boy worse. He sighed. When he learns the whole truth, I doubt he will ever forgive me. Kurenai had never seen her Hokage look so defeated before. I think, she began, but her voice trailed off. I think he is more forgiving than we believe. Times were chaotic back then, and you chose the best course you could. He will understand that. Would you in his place? The Hokage asked. The question caught Kurenai off balance. She realized that her smoldering resentment of his reluctance to pursue a dangerous investigation had been apparent all along. She felt shamed, a little, by that. Perhaps, she said, realizing it was more true than she first thought, but I think he is more forgiving than I. After all he has been through, he still wishes to become Hokage, knowing what the job entails. The old man seemed to gather himself and leaned back slightly in his chair. That is one of the more amazing things about the boy. While you are probably correct about his nature, I still need to find some way of making amends. I will leave it to you, Kurenai. I only hope you are correct in your assessment. Kurenai inclined her head respectfully toward her leader, a man she revered even more now than she did before. I hope I am right as well. I do not see any other way for this to end well. After the Genjutsu seminar, Hinata stayed in training area 19 with Naruto. Her father hadn't expressed any concern when she informed him she would be doing extra training in the evening. Honesty required Hinata to admit that there were places she would rather spend time at than home, and this was one of them. Her training partner immediately sprang to his feet and began making an extremely exaggerated series of stretches. Grimacing comically, he grunted and groaned as Hinata suppressed a smile. His habit of trying to do everything in as funny a manner as possible was also one of the things she admired about him. He always wanted those around him to be smiling and laughing. She knew she had far too little of either of those things in her life. She must have let a little of her smile show as she rose to her feet, because Naruto stuck his lower lip out in an exaggerated pout. Hey, he exclaimed, it's not funny. I don't think I've ever sat in one position that long in my life. Abruptly his face fell. And then when I do finally get to do something, I can't make that chakra interrupt jutsu thing work right. But you were able to do the other method, she reminded him gently. Yeah, that's right, he agreed, brightening. It seems like I can do that chakra pulse thing fairly well. Hinata found herself nodding agreement without saying a word. The truth was that he'd done quite a bit better than fairly well. She activated her Byakugan just before he released the pulse, something she never casually did when she was looking at the boy. She didn't want anyone to get the wrong idea, especially after Ino had asked her some very embarrassing questions about Sasuke after school one day. But the chakra spike she felt was so strong, too powerful to be coming from the genin before her, no matter how hard he tried. It didn't seem possible, so she activated her Byakugan to search for the real source, and found Naruto, shimmering with gathered chakra, swirling in complex patterns around his navel as he concentrated. She'd never seen anyone gather that much chakra before, including her father. When Naruto released the pulse, he glowed within her special vision and then his aura exploded outward. The only thing she could think of when she saw it was the old tales of Susanoo, stepping out of a thunderbolt as it struck the ground. Then the shockwave passed and Naruto was still standing there, looking a little embarrassed while everyone stared at him. And now she was training with him. When Naruto finished stretching and grunting, he looked over at Hinata. What do you think we should work on first? Hinata could barely force words out of her tightening throat. Anyo, whatever you think we should do is fine, she squeaked out. Naruto frowned and she wondered what she'd said wrong. I don't really know what we should work on first. Do you have any suggestions? Hinata swallowed. She was uncomfortable, but she was also bolstered by the thought that Naruto didn't seem to be knowingly putting her on the spot. Kei Kurenai-sensei said that each of us has things to learn from the other, she said. Naruto nodded.